I read a book called The Primal Scream by Arthur Janoff,
Mm.
and it really, I read it at a time that really helped me. It's like kind of daring to look at something very primal in yourself and not getting blown away by it. Then gives you
Mm.
great mastery in day-to-day living because you're not just being like hooked by everything that really gets you and pushes your buttons. You probably don't have to be as hardcore as like these guys from the 50s and 60s who are like, the only way to get there is to scream until you can't scream anymore. Well, maybe not. You
It
know, you
helps though.
really just have to, yeah, maybe you really just have to be able to sort of,
Yeah.
meditation is another way to go.
Mm.
The
Yeah.
opposite of screaming is to just get still and quiet and follow your breath and see
Hmm.
what emotions and thoughts pop up to pull you away and then just not get devastated by them, but just be with them. So I guess that's where I come from on all the mental illness. And I thought, um, influenced by our culture again and a lot of sick things around us, and again, that hypocrisy. Um, how interesting that we have a character who is, in some ways, she's the Dr. Jade DeCamp is sort of the hero of the whole story arc from her point of view,
Mm.
because she goes into this crazy world and manages to survive.
Mm.
But she falls in love with a monster. But that's the only way she ever comes to terms with some monster she's had in her own past.
Mm.
So, that was like definitely a psychological story. When Yuzna was interested in making the film, and his films are pretty trippy. Um, I mean, Reanimator is just great.
Oh yeah, it's classic.
and,
It's classic film,
and
huh?
another one called Society.
Hmm.
What a trip that is. So he was very interested in making all these things physical, the body horror and all that. But also he was right there with the idea that, okay, the doctor thinks this is a psychological thriller. The cop
Hmm.
thinks it's a cop movie, and
Right.
who knows what the Faustian character thinks it is. He's just in hell.
Right.
So,
Right. Right. And then you did Doctor Strange as well, right? You had a stint on Doctor Strange, and how did that come about?
um, like I said, there was a time when it was in the 90s, based on the independent comics that I had done. There were people interested in me telling their stories, putting a little bit of new blood into the darker side of the Marvel universe was the goal of Bobby Chase and Evan Skolnick, the editors.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an idea that I thought was great. So I pitched it. And you know how these things work. You're pitching
Yeah.
and there's 7 other people pitching. And they
Right.
could take your pitch or they could take someone else's or they could put the
Make
three
a
of them
Mod
together and
Podge
give it
it.
to somebody else and say, here,
Yeah.
you write this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it's very fortunate that they didn't do that. I've had that happen more than once.
Okay, so you know what I mean.
Yeah. I
So,
mean,
but
yeah. Go
but
ahead.
I liked it. I mean, I had good editors there.
Hmm.
Bobby, Evan, I mentioned them. Tom Brevoort, who edited Carnage when I wrote that. I
Oh,
mean, I had
nice.
editors that really were like trying to do the kinds of stories I wanted to do.
All right.
It was like Marvel had sort of been woken up
By the
by
independence, yeah.
by independence, right?
In some degree, I think the big two are still looking to that well as inspiration. Look at how DC used
Mm,
2000 AD to launch Vertigo,
yeah.
and
No, I think
What,
Tom Brevoort who's still there, would agree. Like, you prove yourself somewhere else, and then we'll be interested in working with you
but
because
also,
they gotta have new stories.
exactly.
like the impact of like when Frank Miller did his Batman stories for DC, that seemed to like bring things, in the mainstream to a more adult level, than what comic books had been before. And certainly was, was the major inspiration for the Dark Knight movies.
Yeah, um, Dark Knight and Batman Year One. I'm thinking of
Yeah.
the Year One that he did with David Mazzucchelli, right? And then
Hmm.
also Dark Knight,
Right.
and then Of course, I always mention Swamp Thing just because I was a big
Oh,
reader of that.
great book. Who was your? Did you prefer? Which artist and which creative team did you prefer? The original or did you
Oh,
prefer Alan Moore or?
see, well, the original came along when I was a kid. And you
Yeah,
had
Bernie
to,
Wrightston and yeah.
right, you had
Yeah.
to love that. But what Alan Moore and Steve Bissett and John Toddleman did was also so interesting.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
mind blowing.
and just so like, you know, forget the fact that he's uh, a monster. Just think about the fact that he's a plant that has this human consciousness,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and he can connect to any plant in the world. I mean, these are big ideas.
Yeah, it was very interactive too. I remember some issues that I had to turn the page while reading because there's a spiral with the words. And
do you prefer characters that have a duality between good and evil, or do you just kind of dive into just the pure madness of of the frustrations of the world, or do you feel like a character could get through it? You know, that there's a change for them, for the better on the other side.
The more I live and the more I write stories, the more I think stories have to change the people that are in them. And it's really great when you can find a way to do that, even in these sort of sequential forms that we talk about, or series forms we talk about, like comic series and television series. But you know, some of that's just someone who's been doing this now for decades and really has to like try to make the payoff and the emotional payoff bigger every time.
right.
Which
segues to our question on what's your writer's process when you're as a writer, when you're being inspired by things. Well, we talked about a little bit of your inspiration with Swamp Thing and other books, but as in general, like what inspires you to write, and then how do you approach sitting in front of that typewriter or computer or notebook when you start to write? Like
lately I've tried to be okay. Like it's okay and I don't care, but I don't always know what's going to inspire me.
mm-hmm.
I actually try to sit my butt down here in my little writing room.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in this year, I mean, we're all home, but you know, we're also like all respecting each other's like creative time. Mm-hmm. So I have 4 hours a day or so that's going to be just thinking about writing and the little bits of, you know, business associated with writing and delivering the writing and executing the writing and blogging about it so people will pay attention to it. So I mean, I really just, you know, tell myself, write it now, fix it later. Don't be too precious about it. Just get it done. That's my process right now. And it's been a very distracting year because I could worry about all sorts of things in the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Worry about my teenage daughter and my wife and myself, and you know, I could mourn the loss of people we've lost this year, but I could also just say like, well, you know, if I'm going to be alive, I'm going to try to do something that has something to show for it and reach people. And then I try to make sure I share it. Right now I'm doing calls like this to share it, share myself, dare to be out there. I did interviews with a interesting podcast called Street Writers. It's on my site if you want to find it. I did another one with a friend of mine from college who does short interviews on Instagram called Life All In. It's about like what makes you feel alive. Where do you take a risk in your life?
I like that.
And you know, I've worked in a lot of different things. I touched on some of them. I mean, some people know them from my biography, and there's a lot of other business writing I did, just strictly to pay the bills and be a businessman. You know, so there's a lot of things I've done to get myself to this point. So now the risk to take is to keep doing it. Again, it may sound like a boring technique, but sit down, write it now, fix it later.
Absolutely.
Because, you know, I mean, I think that people always think of creative and the business side as being, you know, like opposites or stuff like that. I believe that there's actually some synergy between them at times because, you know, like if you're not getting your stuff out there, you know, nobody's going to see it.
Yeah. Lance, I think you and actually all you guys, I think, would appreciate this book I know called The War of Art. Not Sun Tzu's Art of War. This is a play on words, the war of art. And it's really about the difference between being professional and doing your art because you love it.
Right.
Nothing wrong with doing it because you love it, but there is a distinction the author makes, and I'm forgetting his name right now, but it's on my site. There's a distinction that's made, and again, it's that, you know, your job is to get it done and find the people that might appreciate it and get it to them. It's that simple. So, I mean, look, I mean, I don't know everything about all you guys, but I've watched Ray for a few years now, and I know Ray knows the people, right? The people that are going to appreciate what he does. And that's how he finds all the friends that used to go to the live cons, and that's how he's finding the people today that are here on the Zoom con.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I always found it interesting to just come up to people and talk. I guess you and I also just say, hey, how you doing? And just start chatting. And I think that's the best way to approach it. It's all for human connection, you know, and somewhere along the line, try to find some I'm lost for words here, but I guess something common, a common place where we can meet, a common ground, and say, hey, are you interested in this or interested in that? Now you're doing like these children's books, you know, and some are children's books for adults. I mean, I think that was also an eye opener too, like, because, you know, I work in the classroom, and then, you know, we see Go to Sleep, Little Creep, and I was like, oh, it's David's book. It's like, you know, it's like, it's kind of interesting, you know, like we intersect on and have many entry points, you know, of entry.
And David, I think I had seen something with you once where you mentioned you also had been involved in marketing as well.
Yeah, marketing for the writing side of marketing, not the analytics, but the writing side, creating content for all media, for companies like Chase and Citi and some education companies and some healthcare companies. And that was me just saying, like, I'm sick of not getting paid. You know, even like, you know, even publishers that you'd have respect for what they were doing. I won't name their names right now because it might just sound just nasty. But you know,
be nasty. No, I'm just kidding.
Even, you
go
know,
ahead.
No, look, you expect somebody like I don't know, Glenn Danzig to maybe pay you late. Right. Right.
Right. Because he's just a rock
Or
star.
Everett Hartsoe, right?
Right.
But you don't expect like some of the top 5 companies to be so late in paying you, or to have to be reminded to pay you. But that's where it was in the 90s, because everyone was hurting, and stores were going out of business. We were losing stores. We lost distributors. You know, you could put a lot of the blame of this on Marvel trying to create this monolithic self-distributor, right?
Right.
So we'll see what happens now that DC's playing the same game.
Right.
I've worked a bit in that world, and I can tell you that sometimes it's the biggest companies that will hold up paying stuff.
Well, maybe, but I mean, the reason I'm a full-time writer again is because I did that for the first 18 years of this century. You know, and it made more money than I made my entire life. So, I mean, it basically is the reason I'm able to be a full-time writer again.
What inspired you to do the children's and the not for children's books?
I'm pretty sure not for children's books was really out of my childhood love of Mad.
Right.
You know, reading Mad in 1974, and reading parodies that were obviously skewed so that they were cool for kids, but mostly really for college and adults. And,
right. Were you like a fan of National Lampoon and things like that?
Yeah. Smart. So then I would just get sick ideas like The Littlest Bitch. She's a 5-year-old CEO. And, you know, another one was The Red Flannel Squirrel, which was my satire on the Velveteen Rabbit story.
Right,
where the dear little stuffed animal learns that they're more loved because they're more beat up. And the red flannel squirrel, of course, is a toy who really wants to be mint condition. And then he realizes the error of his ways, and he knows he needs to be really very beat up to prove that he's loved, because it's always about being loved, right?
Right.
So then he meets the bad dog, Mr. McGregor, chews him to pieces, and he's loved.
Something like the Littlest Bitch. I mean, I thought would actually work very well, like as a cartoon show, like for adults. You know, like sort of in the mold of like a Family Guy or that kind of show.
I'm right behind you.
How would you say it was like different from like, you know, things that had a sort of loosely similar format, like Bourse Baby or something, you know, those kind of things?
Oh, yeah.
You know, but I'm
it's
sure
the
this
kind
is...
of story. It gets its humor from satire. It's a satire of a lot of things, the way people behave like children in business, the way another thing that's big about it is the way that women in business get called rude names, but if a man did the same thing, he'd be called a leader. That's part of the humor in it. And the other part of the humor is just that Family Guy or Boss Baby thing of it's very funny to expect a baby to be a baby and then they have a briefcase, or then they want to do a business review of your quarter. Mom,
yeah, it kind of reminds me of like, you know, even with Peanuts, where you had Lucy with her charging a nickel for her psychiatric advice.
Yeah. God, I love Peanuts. I still recommend that to people who say like, oh, my idea is simple. I don't know if it's going to work. I said, simple. Look at Calvin and Hobbes and Peanuts.
Right.
The premise there is very simple. They contain multitudes.
Yeah, like with Charles Schultz, I mean, like almost all of the male characters was like a variation on himself. You know, and that even Snoopy.
I heard that Lucy was based off of his wife.
First wife.
First wife, yeah.
She was based on his first wife, and the interesting thing was like the first wife had that same edge to her, you know, that Lucy did, you know, but when he got married again to like a wife who I guess was a lot more easygoing, if you notice, Lucy by like the 80s or something had kind of mellowed out quite a bit in the strips. And it's like she took on the characteristics of the new wife.
She morphed.
Oh wow! I never heard that.
And she wasn't as entertaining. I kind of missed the old Lucy.
Well, and you asked about not only the satirical ones, but the real like authentic, you know, made for kids stories. And that's something I've spent a lot of time on in the past couple of years. If you go to the site, you'll see
it's a great book.
Little Creep. And I've also done, during the year of COVID, I've done like Facebook Live readings of the book so that people have a little story time there online. And this book really, really came about. One, my love of classic monsters, but also my love of sharing a story with my daughter. And a lot of time in the reading chair. And so I started wanting to do these books that would be fun and noisy, lots of sound effects, sort of making a hybrid of comics and picture books, and always about like everyday problems that little kids have, and kids that are brave enough to risk facing those problems, but with different characters, monsters, dinosaurs, robots, dogs. It's something that goes a little contrary to the current trend in children's publishing to have everything be very memoirish.
Right.
I'm not quite as much into that right now. So, I mean, I've been doing that, and I write about it on the blog, and I work with some other writers who are all working on these stories. We pass our things around, and Penguin Random House published the first one, and I'm trying to publish more.
That's fantastic. So you have any top secret projects you're working on that you can't mention by title, but more
children's books, a couple of adult adult fantasy or adult horror things with my long-term partner, Tim Vigil.
No, so you're gonna have a return, perhaps a sequel, or
well, I don't know if you call it a return. And then here's a strange, ironic story that really fits the indie comic milieu.
Yeah.
This is the year Tim and David. We started with Absolute Underground, a Canadian music and culture magazine, mostly focused on like metal and punk, but also including everything else. They did one-page stories by us for once a month, like for a couple of years. And we would really take different fantasy topics and crazy topics, and either I would write something first or Tim would sketch something first, and then the other one would step in and do an accompanying body of words or an accompanying sketch, depending on which came first. And we ended up with about 60 pages of this. So we thought, well, this year, for this year's conventions, maybe kicking off at the Great Eastern, or not Great Eastern, what's the East Coast Comic-Con that was supposed to happen?
Yeah, East Coast, yeah.
And then maybe we'll do a Bronx Heroes, and we'll do a San Diego, and maybe we'll even do, I don't know, WonderCon. Who knows?
Yeah, I actually like WonderCon better than San Diego.
Oh, okay, and we'll sell it at all of them.
Yeah.
And we'll just be something special for just the people that met us at a convention to buy. 20 or 30 bucks, and we'll sign it and write in it and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we went to the printer, and the next thing we knew, New York was shut down, and then the rest of the country was shut down, and then conventions were shutting down.
Right.
And, you know, probably more important to live than to have a convention this year.
Absolutely.
But it really sucked. We printed a couple hundred of these.
Right. Is that spine reversed, or am I just seeing things backwards in the camera? Oh, okay.
I guess you're seeing it backwards in the camera.
Right. Oh, that's great.
Right? So it's like, there's a quote from me for all of them. There's a picture from Tim for all of them. They get into fantasy, they get into drama, but there's some crazy stuff in here. And it's not for kids, but it's not as dangerous as Faust.
Right.
Put it that way.
Yeah, we're in such a sterile society. As a writer, I mean, do you feel like you're walking on eggshells sometimes? Like, I don't know if I should write this. I mean, sometimes as a writer myself, I just like, did I write that? Should I have wrote that? You know, should I erase it? I mean, do you ever go through that as a writer, like self-editing, like because of our ever-changing times with the Me Too movement and things like that?
Well, you can't. I mean, you can't worry about what someone's going to think about you. However, that said, I want to be, I mean, no one's ever going to call me politically correct in every ways, but I do want to be like morally correct, if whatever that means to me. I mean, I want to have certain standards of, you know, trying to stay away from, you know, getting into relationships that abuse people, doing business that abuses people, doing things that are unfair. I mean, that said, I mean, I know there could be a situation, right, as an older white guy, right? There could be a situation where I want to write all different kinds of characters, some of them who aren't older white guys. If anyone ever told me, hey, you can't authentically write that character, I'd say, well, I don't know, maybe you may not want to read it, but I mean, I think I could write whatever I wanted to try to write if I was trying to tell the truth.
Right.
So I mean, and that's probably the only area where I might sort of get into a philosophical argument with someone about some of these things, because I'm not sure if there's any such thing in such a melting pot world that we live in as like absolute authenticity and absolute authority to like own writing certain kinds of characters.
Yeah, I could see like with like now they say, well, this female writer should only write female characters, or transgender characters should be written by transgender writers. I think absolutely there's tons of rooms for that. I'm sure there's tons of those writers, but as a writer, why can't I write about that? I feel like the world is like saying you can't do this, you know.
Well, they're doing that with the voice actors on speaking of things like Family Guy. They announced that one who's been doing Cleveland since the beginning, the black character on the show. He's a white guy though, and he had to step down from the role yesterday after doing it from the beginning.
Well, see, this is one of the interesting questions of our time, and we want to be fair, and we want to include all these voices.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
now, how do we fairly include them and not, and not violate some basic freedom that everyone would have to write all sorts of characters? Because I might write, and maybe, some people might just say, "Oh, old man, shut up."
Right. I mean, my favorite
you're not
characters to write are
depressed.
women. I like to write women characters or black characters, but the most trouble when I'm writing male characters is writing a convincing male, because I'm not a super macho guy. When I write them, they come off as Republican. like my relatives, the relatives I can't stand having a conversation with. It's like he's right wing. So whenever I write a male character, he comes off very right wing, because that's what's in my family. Even though I'm not a right wing person, I'm extreme left. But it's hard to write an extreme left person unless they're a different gender. I don't know. Do you ever have trouble as a writer doing that? Like I prefer to write female characters. It's weird.
I've always wanted to be able to write, like I said, write anything and just try to tell the truth. And I mean, there's all sorts of considerations and questions that come into the marketing and distribution of all these things. And I know it's right now especially we're really making strides at getting a lot of original voices heard. So I think that's important.
Thanks for being on this episode. And one more time, if you could tell us all your social media links where people can follow you and follow your blogs.
Yeah, well, there's one place to find everything. It's pretty easy that way. Like I said, this year, not being out there and not seeing all of you people face to face, I just finally got out of my own way and made a beefed up version of my blog into a little simple WordPress website. So inwalkedquinn.com is pretty easy to find. And then there's a blog with writing on all sorts of pop culture topics. You could filter it by children's or not for children if you really have a particular interest, like you just want to see the adult horror that's there. If you just want to see the baby monsters.
Right. I love the baby Godzilla, by the way. I was like, that had me roaring in laughter when I read that. I was like, I think when I was reading, Go to Sleep, Little Creep, that book, it transported me to childhood, and at the same time to like my love for, like you said, like monsters and sci-fi movies, is like all of the things you watched as a kid growing up, but it's funny to see it personified as a child. That's like,
I love it. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So keep in touch, everyone. Inwalk Quinn, you can find everything. I'm not on Facebook much, but there's a little bit of stuff on there. I'm on Instagram a lot because it's easy and it's very visual, and I share.
I agree. Thanks everyone for joining us, Ram, Lance, and you people out there. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Bronx Heroes Live.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay creative.